Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm extremely happy to be here, especially in Denver, because this is where I was born. It was about 45 years ago when I left. Actually, come to think of it, my grandfather told me they'd be building a statue in my honor, and I haven't found it yet, so if you happen to see it, let me know. Maybe I just haven't found it yet. I am Dr. Janet Bahouth. I am an owner-engineer of Impact Research. We are a transportation safety engineering firm out of Baltimore, Maryland. And today it is my pleasure to moderate this session, especially because of our fantastic panel of speakers today. We will hear how your work contributes to several other disciplines and perspectives, from auto manufacturers, safety research, and injury prevention. Our speakers will explain how boots on the ground experience and local level reporting are used in vehicle safety design, and also in countermeasure development. So as necessity is the mother of invention in this world of transportation safety, data and data sharing are the mothers of progress. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sushant Jagtap. He is our first speaker today. He is a research engineer with IIHS, where he shares in the IIHS dedication to reduce all kinds of losses, death, injury, and property damage. Today we'll learn from him how he and IIHS rely on crash reports and hospital data to identify roadway safety problems for the development of consumer rating programs. With that, Mr. Jagtap.
Thank you, Janet. There you go. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming for today's session. So I'm so delighted to be here. This is my second time at Lifesavers, and last year I had so many interesting conversations with all the different perspectives that people brought here. So as soon as I was presented at this year's opportunity to speak at this year's, I just jumped on it. So and specifically, I'm so glad that I'm joining this panels. And I couldn't think of any better set of people to be on stage with. So thank you, Janet and Christian, for putting all of us together. So if you attended today's plenary session in the morning, I think this session is kind of going to be a continuation of that, where people there talked on a higher level about how boots on the ground and community interaction is very important for all types of safety levels. So I think that was much at a higher level. So here you'll get to know more about examples of how exactly those boots on the ground type of data helps us as researchers or safety managers at different positions to do our job. So before I talk about how your data helps us, I want to understand today's audience a little bit better. So this is the Lifesavers attendee breakdown by job category, and we'll just do a quick poll to see what type of attendee we have today for this session. So by show of hands, let's see people who work in law enforcement. Okay, thank you. People who work in state, federal, and local governments. Okay. People who work in community programs and child passenger safety. Yeah. And then finally, people who work in research, public health, medical side of things. Quite a few, okay. So I think we kind of have a good breakdown of all these different job categories, and I understand there's some type of overlap also depending on type of work. So I think this session will give you more insight on how to connect some of the dots that you guys do work and collect data on the field, how that is used by the industry to make vehicles safer. So before I go into that, a little bit more about IIHS. So IIHS is a non-profit organization solely funded by insurance with the aim of reducing deaths, injuries, and property damage from motor vehicle crashes. We are an organization about over 100 employees. We are based in Virginia. We have 2 offices, one near D.Sc and one in Ruckersville, as shown there. So how do IIHS achieve their goal of saving lives? So the answer is with the help of all our consumer rating programs, so a few of which I've highlighted here. So we started our consumer rating program in 1995 with the launch of Moderate Overlap Crash Test Program, all the way to the left there. And over the years, as you can see, we have added different types of testing, looking at different crash configurations, different ways people are getting injured. We have also added crash avoidance and mitigation type of testing. So over the years, this is how we make cars safer. So the idea is we do this consumer testing, we give out a rating and push that out for all the consumers, and consumers who are looking to get a new car will consider safety rating as one of the factors when they're buying a new car, and that in turn will push automakers to make cars safer. So in order to understand how and when your work helps us, I think it's important to understand the flow of work at IIHS. So how do we develop a crash test? So I just have a couple of slides to highlight that. So the first step in developing a crash test at IIHS is to identify the problem from real-world data. And a lot of your work helps us to identify that gap in the automotive safety. So example can include, we look at federal databases such as FARS and CIS, we look at state and police reported crash data, we may look at hospital data as well. A lot of insurance companies are our members, so we look at insurer data as well in some aspects. So all this data helps us identify the missing gaps in safety, which IIHS can help address. So once we identify that gap in safety, the next step is to recreate that issue in the real world, the issue that we found in the real world data in a lab environment. So of course we need to replicate that in a lab environment, then only we can think about countermeasures and how to address that safety gap. Which is then followed by simplifying that test condition into a repeatable lab condition. So, there's a lot of things that goes into a crash test, and there can be so many different things that goes on real-world data. But what we do is simplify that problem into a repeatable test condition. So we're addressing that specific issue, and at the same time, we are not unnecessarily complicating the test. And also, as I mentioned, whatever we do, a lot of automakers or third-party labs do similar kind of testing. So we need to make sure whatever we do in our lab is repeatable across different labs. And the step 4 includes finalizing the ratings metrics, which is basically how do we draw the lines of what vehicle performance is good, acceptable, marginal, or poor. This is another area where I think real-world data is very important in this stage, because we design the ratings metrics such a way that we try to tackle the fatality mechanisms that we see from the real-world data. So we use metrics, we weight those metrics in such a way that we correlate those to the real-world injuries that we are seeing in the field. And finally, an equally important step is to revisit that real-world data based on how the vehicles have performed in our test a few years down the line, and see, do we really see a difference that a good rated vehicle is doing better job in the field for protecting occupants than a vehicle that is poorly rated. And that can justify, help validate our testing program, but it can also give us what are the various areas where we can still improve upon. Do we need to change the test in some way that is not currently being replicated? Do we need to change the ratings metric such a way to save more people? So this is again an important step, completing the whole loop of the crash test development process at IIHS. And then again, the new cycle starts where if we change a test, then we look at the real world data, do some lab reconstructions, and it keeps on going like that. So now we understand a typical crash test development process at IIHS. I'm going to give you some very specific examples of when in the past we have used some of the hospital data, real world data, and how that has helped us to develop some of these tests in the past. So the first one I'm going to highlight is small overlap rating program. So this is a chart of our moderate overlap front crash test ratings, which was launched in 1995. As you can see, in 1995, more than half the vehicles were rated poor. And over the years, automakers have done a great job of improving the countermeasures for this test. And since 2013, all of the vehicles that are rated in this test are rated good. I want to highlight 2007. So in 2007, as you can see, more than 90% of vehicles are good or acceptable. But around the same time frame, we saw almost around 14,000 front occupant fatalities. So in order to understand what exactly is going on there, we took a more closer look at real-world data. So this pie chart here shows crash configuration for serious injuries in frontal crashes with good moderate overlap rating. And what we found out was almost a quarter of those crashes are small overlap type crashes. So imagine a vehicle hitting a pole or a tree on the side of the road. This crash test condition was not replicated by any crash tests back then. So this is how the real-world data, which was from NAS-CDS and back then, helped us identify that almost a quarter of serious injuries on these are in small overlaps, and we need to do something because there is no test condition that represents this type of crashes. So then the next step was to reconstruct those real-world into a lab environment. So we do a bunch of research testing to replicate those test conditions, and that led to the launch of the small overlap program in 2012. In this test, the vehicle is, as you can see, it crashes into a barrier at 64 kilometers per hour, and the rigid barrier overlap is 25% of the vehicle width. So this is a great example of how real-world data really helped us identify what's happening in the real world, and then how we can help to bridge that safety gap. Another example I want to talk about is moderate overlap 2.0. So this moderate overlap rating, we recently updated that test in 2022 to evaluate the safety of rear seat occupants as well. This is the program I worked on, so I want to give that example as well. So the background for this one is that in newer vehicles, what a lot of literature said was that the rear seat occupants have a higher fatality risk than the front seat occupants. And this is not because, this is because the rear seat, everybody was focused on the front seat restraint systems and making front seats safer for drivers and passengers. The rear seat safety advancements had lagged behind. So in 2020, these rear seat occupant fatalities accounted for 7%. So a big chunk. So how did real-world data help us in this case? A lot. So in this case, we looked at real-world data, NAS-CDS and FARS to identify who is sitting back there. So what we saw was, not to the surprise, but half of the occupants that sit back there are 12 years and younger. But interestingly, when you look at who is getting injured and who is getting killed in the rear seats, almost 3/4 or 75% of fatalities are ages 13 and older. So what this data told us was, we have to make sure that whenever we have to use an appropriate size dummy in order to represent the smaller occupants, but at the same time tackle those 3/4 of fatalities in the rear seat. Another way, I think this was a very great example of how this real-world data helped us identify some of the injury metrics. So we looked at NAS-CDS and FARS data, but we actually identified the FARS fatal cases that we were interested in for the rear seat, and we went to the individual police jurisdictions to get more rich data from there to understand how exactly people are getting killed in the rear seat. And what that data told us was, across all ages, a very most commonly injured body region is chest. So what this told us was we need to make sure whatever we develop the injury metrics for the evaluation of rear seats at IIHS, we need to make sure we are evaluating the chest injuries in an appropriate way to tackle those bigger chunk of chest injuries in the field data. And again, that data helped us launch our Moderate Overlap 2.0, which is an update to our Moderate Overlap crash test, which includes a 5th percentile female dummy, which is about the size of a 12 or 13-year-old, again targeting that smaller occupant size, but at the same time looking at the occupants which are getting killed. Next one, I want to highlight truck underwrite. This one was also a very interesting one because this is from the same data set that we looked at for small overlap. What we found out was almost 14% of those crashes were underwrite type crashes. This is a very challenging type of crash because, in most of the vehicles, the idea is that the crash structure in front of the vehicle should crush, absorb energy, and protect the occupants. But in case of underride crashes, that structure, if that structure doesn't engage with the tractor trailers, then you have catastrophic intrusion in the occupant space. So we, again, after looking at the real world data, we did some lab reconstructions. And what we found out was back then, the existing guards on the tractor trailers weren't really doing a good job of protecting underride crashes. So I'll just play a video to show that. So this test is offset to the back of the tractor trailer, and as you can see, the structure that was installed on the back of the tractor trailer didn't really do a great job of stopping the underride crash. So then that data helped us launch our Tough Guard program, which was launched in 2017, where we have three different crash test scenarios where the overlap of the vehicle is center, 50% and 30%, and then all of the tractor trailers that are installed with the guards that can prevent these type of underride crashes are given these Tough Guard. And finally, I want to highlight the LATCH ease of use program as well, which is, I think, more relevant for folks here too. The idea of LATCH hardware is to make CRS installation easier and less confusing. But what we found out was that's not necessarily the case in most of the vehicles back then. So first, we did some volunteer study with a lab to identify what are the characteristics of a good or a correct installation of latch. So what are the hardware characteristics in the vehicle that result in a good installation? And what we found out with that study was there are three characteristics that are very important that results in a good installation. One is depth, so how deep is the anchor? What is the clearance around the anchor to access that? And then how much force is needed for that latch installation. So we found these three criteria are very important to ensure an easy and correct latch installation. But this was done in lab environment. So how do we validate this with real-world data? So then we looked at real-world installation data from Safe Kids car installation from 2010 to 2012. And what that showed us was not only the latch hardware that met all these three criteria, which was depth, force, and clearance. Not only those were most frequently used, but they were also most frequently correctly used as compared to the hardware that did not meet any of those three criteria. So this real-world data helped us validate whatever we learned from our volunteer study and put out our latch ease of use program in 2015. So I hope this gave you some on-the-ground, this gave you some examples of how exactly we use real-world data for our programs and how some of the on-the-ground data that you guys collect really help us, point towards the right direction and, make our tests more relevant for saving people's lives out there. So thank you so much.
Our next presenter up here, we have Schuyler St. Lawrence presenting next. Mr. St. Lawrence is a part of safety research and regulation at Toyota North America, where he is principal engineer. He is subject matter expert in U.S. automotive safety regulation with more than 20 years experience across many aspects of automotive R&D, including manufacturing, quality engineering, safety critical research, and regulatory affairs. Today he will speak to us about PARTS, which is the world's largest automotive safety data sharing consortium. As you can imagine, boots on the ground data is vital to this existence. So, Schuyler?
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Janet. And yeah, I think that note about the boots on the ground, the actual on-the-scene data is the key to what I'll be presenting today. So first, a little bit of background. So I work for Toyota, but today I'm here representing the Partnership for Analytics Research in Traffic Safety. So today's presentation, I really want to explain how this group, the PARTS Partnership, uses crash data that's collected on the scene by law enforcement officers and put into a police crash report, and how that is turned into the analysis that we do that can inform both the automakers and the federal government on how we can improve our safety system designs and also a better understanding of the crash situation in the United States. I'll also reflect a little bit today on the data limitations of what we can do with this state crash data and some opportunities for improvement that are available or out there to better inform the design and impact of the advanced vehicle safety technologies. So a little bit more about this organization, PARTS, the Partnership for Analytics Research in Traffic Safety. Like I said, it is a public-private partnership between the United States Department of Transportation and a group of automakers. So it's a voluntary participation organization, completely funded by the United States Department of Transportation. So what we do is we pool real-world data collected from the states on the scene of crashes with data from the automakers that provide information on which vehicle safety systems are installed on every vehicle involved in these crashes. So what we can do then with that information is pair them together and have a collaborative safety analysis for discovering how these systems are performing in the real world, as well as the gaps that might remain with some of the system's performance. So we really want to gain real-world insights into the safety benefits of these new technologies and how they can be improved. This slide shows you who's a member of the organization. So we currently have 10 automakers, representatives of several of whom are in the room today. We represent about 85% of the U.S. passenger vehicle market on the industry side. On the government side, we have participation from the Volpe Center, which is part of the Department of Transportation, as well as NHTSA. And then we have an independent third party, the MITRE organization, that protects all of our data because each member is submitting what I'll call some relatively sensitive data. So we have this trusted third party to protect everything, to carry out the analysis, and to manage the project. So each member here on the screen submits data to the organization, which is then pooled together into a large database that we can use to get collaborative interpretation of results once they're done. And like I said, this independent third party is the one that does all that, but we work closely together with shared decision-making and contributing to the research agenda so that each member has a voice in the process of what we're doing. So I talk about this data that we've all submitted. This gives you an idea of the scope of the data. And so if any of you know or are law enforcement officers in any of the states highlighted here, a big thanks to you. We're taking your police reports. If you've filled out a police report for a crash since 2016 for a vehicle that's made by one of the manufacturers on the previous screen, your data is being used here in this organization. So in phase 2, which wrapped up in late 2022, we had about 2.5 million crash-involved vehicles in the study, where we've paired a vehicle with a crash that happened through the VIN, and now we know which safety systems were on each of these vehicles in the crash. We're in the middle of phase 3. We don't have any results to show from phase 3 today, but we have completed the data collection, and with the new now 16 states and 8 years of data being captured from the state police crash reports, we have about 37 million vehicles in act crashes. You combine that with the more than 100 million vehicles that were submitted, or for which data were submitted from the automakers, we pair those together, and now in the 2024 linked data set, we have about 3 times as many as we did previously, so we have 7.6 million crash-involved vehicles. To our knowledge, this is the largest study of crash-involved vehicles in the U.S. to date. We're not going to stop there. We'll hope to continue as we grow, but for now, that's where we are. You obviously can't read this chart. This is just to show you that there's a lot of vehicles are going into this. We have 169 vehicle models included in this study from the 10 partners across, let me count them up now. We had 7 segments previously, and the new one we now have 10 vehicle segments for which data have been submitted by the automakers. Essentially, this covers almost every vehicle that's being sold in the U.S. right now by these partners. There's a few minor exceptions where if it's a very low volume or maybe a sports car. We are also starting a new focus on collecting data from EVs. Even though they are low volume, we still want to capture that so that we can start to understand what's going on with those vehicles. So this slide is really aimed at anybody who's out there collecting this data on the street when the crashes happen. So here's what we're taking from you. So right now, in order to be included, the states have to provide all police crash reports, and they must include the full 17-digit VIN so that we can combine the crash with the vehicle. In order to be used here, we also need specific availability of certain data fields like manner of crash, so we can understand whether it was a rear-end crash, whether it was an intersection crash, a side impact. We'd like to understand the vehicle maneuvers prior to the crash, the initial point of contact for both of the vehicles or all of the vehicles included in the crash. And we also want to understand the first or most harmful event so that we can understand which systems that are on the vehicle might apply to an individual crash. We also look at the crash factor data, like the light and weather conditions, the road alignment, whether or not there was driver distraction or impairment, the location of the crash, whether it was rural or urban. And key to any of the data use is that the fields must be standardized across states. Given that there are 50 different ways of reporting, that can be a little challenging, which is why we're only using 16 states at the moment. But as that improves through funding from NHTSA to increase their amount of electronic data transfer systems, we hope to expand the number of states in the near future. So for example, the way that driver impairment is coded or reported by some of the states can be inconsistent. So we've struggled with that a little bit, and don't have any results to share based on driver impairment yet. Stay tuned for hopefully in the future when we can do that. And there's a lot of work that goes into standardizing even the data that are relatively standard from the states. So appreciate all of the data collection and all of the work that's done by the MITRE Corporation to standardize all this data so that we can use it. Just a little bit more details. I won't read everything on here, but these are some pretty detailed data that we like to use. So if these are there, we're very happy. We need these data to understand how the systems are working, all the way down to injury level by each person in the vehicle, if possible. We want to know about the road surface conditions, whether it was snowing or raining or slick. And then there are a few desired data elements that we don't need, but if you're out there collecting the data, and you can include things like crash intersection type, whether it was a T intersection or a four-way intersection, or if you've driven around Northern Virginia, you know there are some absolutely insane seven-way intersections that are awful to drive through. We'd like to know road grade, if that's available, so we can understand how changes in elevation might be affecting some of the systems that are out there. So all of this data for every single one of those 37.6 million crashes I think we have goes into the database to be paired with our vehicles so that we can study these new and emerging systems. So we published a report in late 2022, so that's what I'll be sharing a couple of results from here. Like I said, we don't have anything yet from phase 3. Stay tuned later this year when we should. But we've studied these 6 different technologies that are being deployed widely across the fleet. So forward collision warning and lane departure warnings. Then we've gone to the more active crash avoidance safety systems like automatic emergency braking, pedestrian AEB, and lane keeping assist. And then finally, we also looked at what might be called SAE Level 2 partial automation driving support, what we call in this study lane centering. So this is an active system that will both keep you in the lane actively as well as manage your distance to any cars in front of you. It's adaptive cruise control combined with lane centering. So when we published this result, here's a few headlines. We basically found that forward collision warning in combination with automatic emergency braking reduced front to rear crashes by about 50%. Now, this is not a unique finding to this group. It's the biggest sample size, but there's other groups that have found consistently about a 50% reduction in front to rear striking crashes when you have AEB. So that obviously begs the question, what about the other 50%? And that's what we're hoping to study in the near future. We've also studied, I'm not going to show any results, but we also studied those other 6 technologies and found that active interventions, like active lane keeping, are more effective than just warnings, although even with this enormous data set, these crashes are thankfully so rare that we haven't achieved being able to statistically significantly prove that the systems are working as well as we were expecting. Just a few more details. So when I say that we use this police report crash data. We actually do. So we're going down and breaking down the effectiveness of, slide shows for AEB, by weather condition, by road surface, by lighting conditions. So the accuracy of this data is really vital to us to understand where are the gaps remaining. So for example, you'd see on curved roadways down here in the fourth row, we see a lower effectiveness of automatic emergency braking. So that tells us something. That tells us a gap that we have as vehicle manufacturers and system designers that needs to be improved. And without the data that is being collected by the police reports, we wouldn't know this. So we really are diving down deeply into those. And here's an example of what each of the members of the group gets. We get an interactive dashboard where you can go dive down even deeper. You can look at only teenage drivers in cloudy weather conditions on curved roads and try to understand the effectiveness. It's really a fun dashboard to play with. You get a lot of really interesting insights. And again, all of this is only possible with the accuracy by collecting accurate data on the site of the crash. So a huge thank you to everyone who's out there every day writing these police reports and putting in this data so that we can use it to understand where our systems are needing to be improved and where they're performing well. So like I said, we're in the middle of phase 3. We don't have any results to share today, but we're planning for the rest of phase 3 as well as into phase 4 starting in 2025, where we'll be looking at other things like including vehicle telematics data with the police crash reports so we can understand both what happened on the scene and also what was happening in the vehicle at the time of the crash. We're looking at trying to study how these systems might mitigate injuries. Even if the crash happens, if the vehicle slowed down, that should provide some benefit to the passengers of the vehicle. We're trying to understand that. We also want to look at expanded attribute level analysis. So this helps manufacturers and NHTSA understand what is it about these systems or different systems that are working well or not working so well, so we can understand how to improve the systems overall. We're looking at understanding more roadway data, and then we'll be constantly refreshing the data submitted both by the states and by the automakers. So in the future, as we look towards phase 4, we're going to hopefully, and I really want to focus on this fourth bullet point on the right-hand side there, the anonymized data set sharing. So we've created a pretty impressive and comprehensive data set tying vehicles to crashes in the field. And we would love to figure out a way, we're working to figure out a way that can be shared with others outside of the parts organization, because people within parts, there's a lot of really smart people there, but in no way is it a monopoly of the smart people working in traffic safety. So if we can find a way to share this data and get insights from others, that's one of our big goals for our future growth. So again, really just want to say thank you to the people that are out there collecting the data. So we cannot do these analyses without that data. And with this data, with more and better data, we're able to make better decisions, both as the federal government and as automakers, to improve the systems, to improve the safety of the drivers on the road, and save lives, which is what we're here for. So again, thank you for helping us save lives, and I think we'll have time for questions at the end. All right, thank you. Oh, one last point, if you want to copy this down, you can get all the documentation and the reports that we've published at nhtsa.gov/parts. It's all there. So thank you.
Emma Sartin, Dr. Sartin, serves as a research scientist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Center for Injury Research and Prevention. Her research focuses on studying and alleviating disparities in health behaviors and improving physical and social outcomes for marginalized populations. Today, Dr. Sartin will speak about how local level data is what we need to find the right solutions for the right communities.
Hi, everyone. I'm also, like my co-speakers that have talked so far, very excited to be here today, so thank you for having me and everyone here. What I'm going to talk about actually shockingly overlaps with some of the other presentations that have already been talked about, but as mentioned, I think I'm a psychologist in training, so I'm much more interested in behaviors while we're on the road and interacting with different safety systems. So with that in mind, My talk today is talking mostly about how we use your data to influence our countermeasures and how we're approaching that. There we go. Okay. As I think has been mentioned, we've really made a lot of great advancements in traffic safety over the last several decades. So this is largely in part due to these really great vehicle technologies that have been discussed today, as well as different countermeasures. Historically, these countermeasures have been enacted at what we call a universal level. So these are through legislation, laws, things of that nature. I've had a few examples up here on the screen, and they have been really effective. So for example, we now see that seatbelt use in the country is around 90%, which is much better than it was in the 80s, when we saw mostly like less than 20%, I think. So, however, when we look a little bit closer, we see that in the last decade or so, our advancements in these health behaviors have plateaued. So seatbelt use is staying at 90%. We're not really making any more progress there. It's the same thing for those other legislation and behaviors that I've talked or showed you on that previous screen. In turn, this is affecting our injuries and our fatalities that we're seeing also being produced after a crash. We also see, if you look closer at the data and you separate different outcomes by different populations, there are really striking disparities happening. This is by all of these different outcomes and more. So if you look at who is being impacted by injuries, fatalities, it very much differs based on who you are. And if we back it all the way up, we can see that these universal approaches are not being effective specifically for these groups. So there is a gap in what we've previously done that suggests that these universal approaches have what we call saturated the market. So they've really influenced everyone that they can, and we need more updated approaches moving forward in order to continue moving the needle to the vision zero. Taken together, my team at CHOP have really thought hard about this and are approaching this from now a public health lens of we think that we need tailored countermeasures that are directed to communities that are most vulnerable in order to take the next steps in traffic safety in tandem with these really great vehicle technologies and roadway designs that we see coming out. The way that we approach this is by following this wheel. So first step in the wheel, we need to assess what's going on. We need to have updated and timely data that tells us, where are crashes happening, how are they happening, and who's being injured. We can then use that information to locate specific communities that remain at a higher risk or have a predominant need in that topic area. So, for example, we might look at pedestrian deaths, and we might look overall at a state and say, who is being impacted the most by pedestrian deaths? Once we locate those communities, we can then allocate, which is our next step, resources and countermeasures that are tailored to that community and their needs to have the most impact on those pedestrian fatalities. Then, of course, like good researchers and community stakeholders, we want to evaluate our countermeasures. We want to make sure that they are indeed doing what we hope that they're doing. And then we start this process all over again and continue going on. In order to follow that wheel, we really need accurate and timely data. To address that need, we've started for over a decade now making this giant data warehouse called the New Jersey Safety and Health Outcomes Data Warehouse. I'm going to call it the NJ Show. But essentially what we've done, we have state data from numerous administrative agencies across the state, and we've linked them at the individual level. So what I mean by that is if someone has a driver's license, they were involved in a motor vehicle crash, they were taken by EMS to a hospital, we have all of the records in those different systems linked at that individual person. So that way we can follow them longitudinally across the crash timeline. We know what they were doing and what they were like before a crash happened. We know what happened during that crash. We have the really detailed information that Schuyler pointed out. And then we also have what happened after the crash. So how long did EMS take to get there? What type of hospital were they treated at? What was their treatment at the hospital? And so on. So this really allows us to not only follow people long term, but identify who is being involved in different ways in crashes and how those outcomes differ based on who those people are and also where they live. So that is also something I want to highlight about our database is we have taken residential addresses and geocoded them, meaning we know where people who are involved in crashes live, not only where they crash, but where they are coming from. So again, we can identify and tailor these countermeasures to them who might be crashing at higher rates. So far, we've done about 50 research studies using this data. They do span more than just traffic safety. We have data in a lot of different health topics now as well. But that's a QR code that will take you to our website and let you look at all of the different topics that we have so far looked at. Also, kind of piggybacking on some previous talks, integrated, this linked data set and this approach we think is really crucial, but it's often out of reach for the people who can make the most impact with it. So as a researcher at a hospital system, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not the one in the community that's really driving change. To make that happen, for the last 2 years, we've been developing a Center for Integrated Data. And what this is a website with a data dashboard that you can explore our powerful data set and look at different outcomes at the community level in New Jersey. So if you're, for example, just a community member who's trying to make change, you can click on your community and see how you're doing at different traffic safety outcomes compared to the rest of the state. We're hoping that this can help empower more people at the local level to drive change. All right, so now I'm going to switch over and give you a few example studies of how we've been using this data and how we think it can be really helpful. I think one of the most well-known studies from this is actually in teen driver safety. We validated the New Jersey decal law that went into effect. That was the first of its kind. However, I'm going to skip over that and I'm going to focus on child passenger safety because that is my area of focus for the most part. So first, I'm going to show you some examples of what we can do with linked crash reports and that geocoded address data that I talked about. So in this study, we looked at data from 2014 to 2017, and we found that there were a total of about 59,000 drivers who were traveling with children under the age of 8 in the car who were involved in a crash. Overall, if you just look at the crash reports, we see that 72% of those drivers had all of the children in the car in a child restraint system. You might see CRS here on the screen. But if we go a little bit further and we connect that to the residential address and we map what that looks like, that's what this figure is on the screen. So the darker, these are census tracts, all of these different shapes on the state. The darker census tracts indicate census tracts where the drivers had all of the children in the car appropriately restrained in a CRS according to New Jersey state law, which is more progressive compared to other states. The lighter colors indicate census tracts that had less of that compliance, is what I'll call it. While you can see the variation just by looking at the map, so those two census tracts that are right next to each other have very different compliance rates. We took this a little bit further, and we found two census tracts that have the same exact number of crash-involved drivers. One census tract had a 94% compliance rate with child restraint system use, and the other one had only 46%, so less than half of the drivers had all of their children appropriately restrained. When we went further, we mapped how CPST checkpoints were being displayed throughout the state, as well as where pediatricians were located in the state. And we saw a very striking situation where the states or the census tracts that did not have high rates of compliance did not have those resources. And that's really critical in a talk I'm going to give tomorrow about information sources for child passenger safety. Those two information sources can bolster child restraint system use in marginalized and vulnerable groups to match them of their peers. So we see that they don't have access to these really critical resources. And this is what we called a child passenger safety desert. So with just the crash report or just the addresses, we don't really have that information connected like we could here. All right, and then in another study, this one is hot off the press. So we use linked crash and hospital data this time to look at child passengers and their injury outcomes when they were involved in a crash. Of note, this is looking at 2017 to 2019 data, and in 2017, New Jersey updated their crash reports to indicate how children were restrained. So now we know if they were rear-facing, forward-facing, in a booster seat, and a seatbelt are not restrained, which is really impactful for what I am about to tell you. In these 4 years, a total of 84,000 children under the age of 13 were involved in a crash. Overall, we saw that there were very few children who obtained any injuries, which was very positive. I think only about 2% had anything over a minor injury, and there were only 6 fatalities in this entire span. So that's really great for our vehicle technology systems and general child restraint system laws to really showcase how well they are doing. When we look a little bit closer, we do see, though, that those who were injured, injuries increased as child age increased, and injuries increased as children progressed through the restraint system types. Our most serious injuries were, of course, concentrated in children who were unrestrained. But, and I want to highlight how having that linked data is so important. This is the injury information we're using for these numbers is coming from hospital information. This is what the injury data looks like by age. So if we only looked at crash injuries available in hospital records without consulting the crash report, this is the story that we can tell. And you can see here that, as obviously the darker colors are going to indicate more children in that age range having an injury to that body region. So you can see the dark brown would indicate that more than 20% of children in that age category who were injured had that type of injury. So again, we can see here, as children are getting older, we're seeing more injuries appearing, and they're being in that 12-year-old, you can see a very clear head injury. You can see spinal cord injuries are pretty dominant, and then the lower extremities. But we get a slightly different story if we combine this injury information with restraint type. So here you can see, again, as these children are, you can kind of see a following story of the age being important, but it's actually being driven by this restraint type. All of those no restraint children are really driving our numbers there. And we see that spinal cord injury is appearing when we get into the seatbelt using children. So the booster seat and the seatbelt itself. We do see some injuries in rear facing and forward facing children, but they're very minimal, which again is what we would hope to see. And then last, using this data, we did compare the accuracy of crash-reported injury information to hospital data. And unfortunately, it's really not accurate. We saw that both for injury severity and injury location, about 80% were off for both of those categories. That being said, crash-reported injury information was extremely accurate for non-injured children. So that's one of the things we want to caution people with moving forward is they're very good at no injury crashes. However, we do need to be cautious at interpreting that information specifically for our severity and location. In our data, also tagging on to some other talks here, we looked at where children were being injured by where they were listed as being seated in the car. And we saw that in children under the age of 10, if they were in the front seat, they obtained more injuries than if they were in the back seat or a back seat. However, when children hit the age of 10, that difference was no longer visible. So 10, 11, and 12-year-olds were injured at the same rates, regardless of if they were in the front seat or in the rear seat. So that tells us we do need to continue to advocate for more safety for smaller passengers in all locations across the vehicle. So in conclusion, all of these administrative data sources, our EMS records, our crash reports, our hospital records, all of them are so critical in telling a full, complex, comprehensive story so that we can develop and implement countermeasures where we need to. So again, we don't want to put resources towards things that aren't going to have a really high impact. Sometimes that might be we need to really focus in this area on our EMS response times, and other times that might be in preempting a crash completely. Linking these data allow us to understand that story a little bit better, and then having accurate, timely data available to all stakeholders in traffic safety is really critical moving forward. So I echo other talks as well about we need to be better about sharing this information and giving the data to the people who can use it and advance traffic safety. So that is all I have. Thank you very much.
Next is Stephanie Beeman. Dr. Beeman is the Manager of Vehicle Safety Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at Hyundai America Technical Center, which is the U.S. R&D for Hyundai, Genesis, and Kia. With 15 years in automotive safety, she currently directs activities to advance policy and support the continuous vehicle safety developments by Hyundai and Kia. Prior to joining Hyundai, Dr. Beeman conducted research with a focus on occupant injuries, countermeasure effectiveness, and human surrogates. And today, Dr. Beeman will share with us how technology, policy, education, and community are coming together to save lives. Dr. Beeman.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be able to be here with you all today and talk about this particular topic. I was queued up back in 2020 to talk about this topic, but we all know what happened then. And so we're getting a redo today. So thank you for having me here to talk about this particular topic. I think collectively, us in this room, if we are here at Lifesavers, we have either a personal or professional commitment or interest in mitigating injuries and preventing fatalities in the transportation sector. And this is pretty broad, whether that's roadway design, law enforcement, health professionals and how they're treating roadway incidents, us automakers in the design and development of our vehicles and the different technologies that we're incorporating, but also advocates and the policies that they're advocating for, the way that they're educating the community. And so hopefully through this presentation, you'll kind of understand how we see this particular issue of vehicular pediatric heat stroke as really a communal issue that requires a communal solution. So getting all stakeholders involved and figuring out what part each person can play in helping mitigate these types of tragic incidences. Okay, so just a little background on heat stroke for those that may not be particularly aware. So heat stroke in general is when the temperature within your body rises rapidly as a result of the mechanisms for regulating your body temperature begin to fail. So when this happens, it is particularly serious because you eventually end up with organ failure, including the brain or the heart. So it's a very serious condition that needs to be treated very quickly, and any sort of prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures can result in very tragic outcomes. The vehicle itself presents as a particularly risky environment, particularly if that vehicle is off and or it does not have any temperature control that is currently active within the vehicle. The temperature within a vehicle can rise quite rapidly, and it can be much higher than the ambient air temperature. We see this across all temperatures. So even if your vehicle, the ambient air temperature is in the 70s, the interior temperature within that vehicle can be much, much higher. So this is especially risky for children whose body temperatures are much more sensitive to changes in temperature. They experience a much greater rise in their internal body temperature as compared to adults. And so when those children are left unattended in a vehicle, a closed and off vehicle, unfortunately each year we do have incidences where these children succumb to heat stroke and tragically pass. On average in the US, we have about 37 of these deaths each year, and unfortunately that spiked in 2018 and 2019 when we actually saw 53 of these deaths in a single year. Luckily, we have had a lower rate of these incidents over the past several years, and we can only hope that that trend continues to decrease and eventually reach zero. One of the misconceptions around this issue is that it is only a risk in the summer months, or only if you live in like a southern climate that experiences extreme heat. But as I mentioned, that vehicle temperature can change quite rapidly, regardless of where you're located and what time of year it is. So it's something to always be conscious of. So how does this happen? How do we end up with children left unattended in these vehicles? The majority of these are where a child was forgotten. So it's an accidental situation where that child is accidentally left in that vehicle. We're often hearing anecdotally that this is as a result of changes in schedules or distractions, different things going on, and that care person or the person who is operating that vehicle just forgot that they had that child in the back seat, went along with their day. Maybe they forgot to drop them off at daycare. And this is a really unfortunate situation. There was no malice, no ill intent, just a function of being distracted. About a quarter of these are a result of unsupervised access. So this is a child gaining entry to a vehicle that is unlocked and not being able to get out of the vehicle. This happens sometimes particularly with younger children who maybe don't understand how to use the interior handles within a vehicle once they get inside. And then there wasn't an adult that suspected that a child would be in a vehicle, so they weren't necessarily looking for that particular situation. And then another 20% approximately is an intentional left behind. And I don't mean this with malice. I mean this with somebody just doesn't necessarily understand the risks or think that their situation is particularly risky. And so maybe they have left the child, say the child is napping in the vehicle, but unfortunately the temperatures rise and then the child again succumbs to that heat stroke. So like I said, this is a really multi-stakeholder solution, I believe. And so this is I'm going to talk about these 4 particular areas. So technologies, education, policy, and community, so all of us. And I'm going to start with technology. Technology advancements have come a long way, and so we have a number of different devices that are currently on the market as aftermarket, either part of your child seat or as a standalone device that can be incorporated as part of your routine when traveling with your child. So this includes, car seat chest clips, both those that are built into the car seat or those that you can kind of clip on afterwards. And these are often linked through like a Bluetooth to a smartphone so that you can get that type of information. It will alert you to temperature sensitivity, so if there is a general increase in the temperature in the vehicle, it can detect that and it can alert you to that. It can remind you that there's still a child there in the vehicle. There are also mats that you can put underneath, or little sensor devices that you can put underneath the child in the car seat. So this is kind of detecting the presence of an object or a person in this case that would be on that, and then again can either have an alert that pings to your phone, or that is just kind of a standalone alert when you go to exit the vehicle. Maybe it's connected to the powering down of the vehicle itself. So there's a number of different devices that function in that capacity. We've also seen this integrated into various navigation apps. So Waze in particular, you can set it up in your settings to remind you when you've completed your trip to check your rear seat for a child. So this is built into the application. You just go in, you turn on the settings, and you get the reminder. And then there are also some standalone applications. So you'll see these for various smartphones. Some of them are based on GPS. Some of them are based on kind of detecting movement of a vehicle and then the stopping of the vehicle itself. But in addition to that, we all have smartphones, and we use these devices for various novel things and cool technological ways to improve our life and our routines. You can set up scripts that are reminders that can be geofenced, so when you get to a particular location, it can run a script, it can send reminders. And we can do like NFC tags and different things, just things that you can build into your routine that can help serve as additional reminders. So using the technology that we have and the advancements that we've made to really help serve as those reminders and those kind of fallbacks to help us as our schedules get busy. But I also want to talk about what we're doing with technology in vehicles. So as I mentioned, in 2018 and 2019, we saw that really sharp rise when we saw the most incidents. And that really led to a lot of conversation around this particular topic, and automakers were not uninvolved in that discussion. And so in 2019, there was a proactive voluntary commitment that was undertaken where 22 automakers committed to installing a form of rear seat reminder system in their vehicles by 2024, or model year 2025 for those who operate on those design cycles. But having this as standard equipment on nearly all of our vehicles, this commitment has really driven an uptake in this type of system on vehicles. Since the commitment started in 2019, as of our 2023 report, we've had a 5-fold increase in the number of vehicle models that have some form of this technology. And so we are proactively doing this as an industry, and we think that we're trying to do our part here as well. So to talk a little bit about what Hyundai and Kia in particular are doing, we do consider ourselves to be leaders in this industry, and we are glad to not be alone, but we do like to have a little like front-leaning edge on this particular topic. In addition to signing on to that commitment in 2019, we actually fulfilled the commitment in 2022. So as of 2022, nearly all of our vehicles have some form of this technology in their vehicles. And we first put this on the 2019 Hyundai Santa Fe back in 2018, and then rolled it into Kia in 2019 on the model year 2020 Kia Telluride. And we have two different types of technologies that I'll talk about and kind of describe to you today. So we have one that is considered an end-of-trip reminder. So this is where once you've ended your trip and you turn off the vehicle, if a rear seat has been accessed, like a rear door or any way to get into that rear occupant portion of your vehicle, if that has happened either before the trip or during the trip, you will get an alert on your cluster, a visual thing telling you to check your rear seats, and you will also have an audible chime that draws your attention to the situation. And then we have a second system, which is what we call an advanced rear occupant alert system. And this has two phases. So it has that first end of trip portion, but then it also has a sensor detection. So once that vehicle is locked, we have a sensor. So I'll show you a little bit about what that second system looks like. So as I mentioned, we have that first part, which is the reminder. So after you end your trip, you will get that alert to check the rear seats. And then after you've exited the vehicle and the vehicle is locked, the sensor will be activated, either an ultrasonic sensor or a radar sensor, depending on which that vehicle is installed with. And it's going to be looking for movement inside that occupant compartment of the vehicle. If movement is detected, then we move on to stage 3, which is the alarm portion. And so the horn of the vehicle will blare quite loudly, and there will be an alert sent to your connected device. So if you are within the telematics program, there is an alert that will be sent to the connected devices for that vehicle. So it may not just be the driver, it could be anyone that has that vehicle paired on their phone, they're gonna get that alert. So that horn's gonna go off for an annoying amount of time, and then it will stop, and that cycle actually continues 8 times until you have addressed that situation. So plenty of duration of warning. So whether you, the person that was leaving the vehicle, are alerted to it, or if it's a bystander, the hope is that somebody is drawn to that vehicle to identify that there is a potential risky situation at hand. So then moving into the policy space, in 2021, the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act was passed, and this included a provision that would charge NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, to create a law that would require automakers to install rear seat reminders in their vehicles. And so as a result of that law, NHTSA is continuing their efforts and starting to take this on. They have been conducting research for some time and looking at evaluating existing technologies, understanding what solutions are already in the market or what might be feasible in the future. And they're also working on developing different test protocols. And all of this is necessary for them to even consider promulgating a rule. So according to the regulatory agenda that was published last fall, they are looking to put out that first step, that notice of proposed rulemaking, potentially in August. But as you know, election season, we don't know. But they are actively working on it, and that is quite encouraging, and we are engaging as automakers, and I'm sure that safety advocates are also engaging on this topic as well. So moving into the education side of this, so there are entities, organizations that are dedicated to educating individuals about the risks associated with this problem. And first and foremost, I want to thank all of you that are doing these educational efforts. It is very, very important. As I mentioned, that intentional component of these loss of lives is unfortunately high, that 20%. So it's people that don't necessarily understand the risk. So the more we can do to educate folks about these risks, the better things are going to be. So if you are not a dedicated educator, these resources are available to you. So there are different newsletters that go out, or bulletins and website postings that help educate people and give them different tips and tricks so that they can make behavioral modifications and just understand the risks that they're presented with. So we hear a lot like, oh, put your cell phone in the back seat. That's a good behavioral modification. It is very easy, but you're probably not going to go somewhere without your phone or your work bag. Something that helps you better understand that there's still a child back there. You're going to go to the rear seat when you exit that vehicle. There are different training modules, and what I really particularly enjoy are the opportunities we have to speak on local television or radio to help continue to get that message out, because people are not always seeking the information. They may think that they understand the situation, so any way that we can give the information to them, the better. So continued dedicated messaging on this topic year-round, particularly in the hot months though, is super, super important. And then community. So as I mentioned, you may not be a person who is actively working on technology or responsible for educating the public. You may not be part of one of those nonprofit entities that are dedicated to this particular issue, but there are opportunities for all of us in our daily lives or in our professional capacities to help bring awareness to this topic. First responders are regularly engaging with the community. You're either patrolling, or you're responding to incidents, or you're installing car seats. There are opportunities to talk with members of the community and remind them about the risks. Medical professionals, as I mentioned, there are certain hospitals that have these up, but you have people that are going to their pediatricians, right? Having this information readily available, making it a part of the risks and information that you're imparting on new parents or new caregivers is super, super important. And that's a really great opportunity because you already have that one-on-one, that face time with individuals, and capitalizing on that to get that message out there. Teachers, daycares. The daycare age is particularly susceptible to this, but even K through 12. If your children are anything like I was, I took all that information that I received in the demos and the presenters, and I brought it home, and I told my parents how to be better parents on a regular basis. And I was really enforcing all of that. So I think there's opportunities there, maybe an older sibling helping impart that wisdom on their parents, educating them about the risks, because maybe the first child, they didn't have that knowledge, but hopefully maybe later children, they do. And then bystanders. We're all out and about, particularly in the summer months. If you're walking through parking lots, any time of the year, maybe that's a grocery store, maybe it's a fair, whatever it is, just be on alert for potential risks and situations. And then as that bystander, figure out ways that you can potentially intervene and help save lives. I left the CPS technicians for the last because I wanted to highlight a particular event that we had at our facility in Ann Arbor. We host annual car seat fit check events within our community, and we use this as an opportunity with our CPS techs to educate the caregivers or the individuals that are coming and having those car seats fit, oftentimes new parents or new caregivers, about these particular risks. And we even set up a display with a vehicle to show exactly what's happening with that temperature inside the vehicle throughout our event. So we could point to it so they could see it, not just hear it, what that risk looks like. And so you'll see here, when we started our day, it was low 70s. It was 72 degrees, and the vehicle temperature after about 45 minutes was 102. And then by the end of our event, so 2 hours later, the ambient air temperature had only increased about 4.5 degrees, but the temperature inside that vehicle was now 126 degrees. So this was partially sunny, partially cloudy day, not particularly hot, and it was in September, so not one of those months that you think of as a risky situation. But this just helps highlight that risk is there all day, every time of year. So yeah, we can all do something about this. So whether we are in policy, whether we are in technology, whether we are dedicated to educating individuals, or we are just community members, we all have a role that we can play in helping to reduce these tragic incidents.
We have a couple minutes left for discussion or questions, and I see our first question right here.
Jagtap and St. Lawrence presentation on the NHTSA data sets, the VIN decoder data sets. So Jagtap mentioned how important it is to validate a lot of lab testing using real-world data. And I see a lot of use case with the NHTS data in the context of, trying to evaluate the effectiveness of some of these advanced technologies in vehicles, right? And like you mentioned, data integration is still a problem right now. And while they use fast data sets, I still don't see how to integrate fast data sets with like the NHTSA being decoded data sets right now, being that the VIN is not complete, right? And right now we are able to know what, we are able to tell what technologies a vehicle can have, like at the model level, at the vehicle model level, I guess. And that is actually very difficult and very complex, being that some of these individuals that get vehicles have options to like include some technologies. For example, the lane keeping assistance, I guess, when you order vehicles, you can choose to keep or not to keep that in the vehicle, right? And that becomes a very complex situation in using that in the context of trying to evaluate, the effectiveness of some of these technologies. So I guess my question is, with the current data set that we have, what assumption can we make to make this data set useful as it is right now?
I think your question was on multiple levels, so I'll try to answer it in multiple levels. So some of the examples that I highlighted here were specific examples. So we do look at multiple data sets in multiple areas, depending the question that we are trying to answer. So for example, when I talked about the rear seat, we really wanted to get more understanding of what exactly are the injured body regions, what are the percentages, and in order to develop our ratings metrics. So that was like the data set was driven by that question. So we do look at multiple data sets depending on the question. Secondly, about use of vehicle technologies. Yes, I agree with you that if you look at real world data, there have been studies where in some cases people turn off, if they have an option to turn off the lane mitigation system or lane maneuver. And we haven't seen a huge percentage of people using them. And that ties up to human interaction with the system. So we do have a couple of studies. We also recently released our partial automation safeguards, which I think to some extent talk about that, how to make sure the systems that are employed by these auto manufacturers need to be employed in a safe way and in an acceptable way, so that people, if they have an option to turn off, they turn it off, and then you don't see the benefit of those systems. So again, it's very important to go back to the real world data and understand, as what the parts presentation showed, that if the systems are not being used by people out there, but they show effectiveness in our testing, then it's not really a real world benefit. Yeah, add to that.
Yeah, I'll mostly echo what Sushant said. The parts study right now that I showed earlier is essentially an effectiveness of these technologies as they're used by the public. So, like we have both mentioned, a lot of people turn them off, especially the lane departure ones. It's well understood that those can be, I'll just go ahead and say, annoying for a lot of drivers. And so what we've studied in parts incorporates that. So we show some effectiveness even with half the people roughly that we expect to turn them off. Now, one of the things that we're really hoping to do, I think I mentioned it, is incorporating this vehicle telematics data into the data set so that we will know at the time of the crash whether the system was on or not. It gets relatively complicated in terms of things like data privacy and stuff like that, so we're working through that process so that we can understand better how these technologies both are being used and then how effective they are. So right now what we have are estimates. I'd say that for AEB, the automatic braking, not very many people turn that off. So I think I trust that 50% reduction pretty well. When you get into some of the other ones, our current estimates are better than a guess, but they're our best estimate for the people that use them. But we do have a lot of improvement both in terms of understanding when they're on, when the people are using these systems, and also which vehicles that they're on. I think Parts has done a good job with that, but for the broader public, I think there might still be a gap for the non-Parts members to understand whether the vehicles had the systems. So we have room for improvement, I'll say.
Yes, good morning. So my question is for the research that was done in New Jersey. And the question is, it seemed like topically, of course, a correlation between as the child ages, the one slide that you showed, and the increase in injury. And I was wondering if that, was some correlation between frequency in the vehicle, and was that taken into consideration when you were doing that research?
So I think what you're asking about is exposure. So if children who are older are more likely to be traveling in the car. When we broke down our age ranges, it's actually shockingly consistent in the frequency of crash, like the ages across the age range. So I think of the 84,000, it was very evenly distributed across all 12 years of age. To like 100s, like somewhere in the 6,000 per age category range. We are following that up to do more sophisticated statistics to account for more exposure level type metrics, but that data did not have that. My suspicion is that's not just what's happening because of the correlation also with the restraint use, which I think is more telling. And also, to just add on to our limitations, we, for that injury analysis, did not look at further crash scenarios, which we are also exploring in our next series of analyses. So things like speed of the vehicle and impact, location, and things like that.
This question's for Mr. St. Lawrence. Regarding the data in, data out aspect, I know nationwide there's been a push for enhanced crash reporting at the police officer level. My question regarding that is, what has been done from NHTSA or other stakeholders to make that information gathering easier for the actual boots on the ground person? Because as a line level officer, traffic investigator, gathering 8 pages of information on a property damage accident when there's 7 more waiting is becoming task saturation for the line level. I know there's a lot of Carfax for police has come out with some stuff with VIN verification and data collection there. Is there anything else on the horizon that, say, the boots on the ground guy can look forward to versus the people in D.C.?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And of course, we understand that there's a lot of different priorities when it comes to report these police crash reports. So I'm probably not the best person to answer. I'd love to have one of my NHTSA colleagues here. There's been a lot of work that they've been doing with both with funding and funding the back end on the electronic data transfer side and also the standardized format. And unfortunately, I can't get it. I don't know the details of those. So, but I'm happy to put you in contact with the folks that we work with at NHTSA on parts, who are very well informed on what is coming from them to make this data collection easier. Because, of course, we want all the data we can get, right? But there's a lot of other things going on for the police officers, the law enforcement officers there on the scene. Like you said, you may have 7 more backed up on your plate right now to get to. And so the level of detail is difficult. And happy, I mean, we completely understand. But afterwards, if you want to come up, I can give you some who to contact at NHTSA that could give you a better answer than I can.
Yeah, so I know I didn't speak for, as this panel did, but we are a data-centric company myself, Impact Research, and I think Schuyler could probably attest to this. If we could have everything on every crash, that is absolutely the way to go. But I think it depends on what you're trying to solve. If we're going after injury, I need to know if they're belted or not. if you're going after injury, I want to know what kind of seatbelt marks they might have on the belt itself versus just not having any on the belt. It's very different because that then relates down to injury. So it's very specific things depending on what you're talking about. So if you're trying to make the technology in the vehicles better for the next crash in the future, then that's helpful to get all of that information from you as well, because it's what are we missing? What don't we know, or what might we know not a lot about? So, geez, it's a hard question to answer for sure, but keeping in mind what it is we're trying to do, that's the best thing I can tell you. Just do everything you can for it. It's tough.
My question's for Dr. Sartin. I'm a traffic engineer for a local city. When we use state data to determine impairment with fatal crashes, we're about 125% underreported when the deceased was impaired. So we now work with our coroner's office to ensure that the autopsy, we get all of that. And a lot of it's because it takes so much longer for that process to go through, so it's not always captured, I'm curious, when you're using hospital data for injury crashes, have you seen, when you compare that to state crash reports, are you seeing that really drastic difference between what the hospital says is an impairment crash and what you're seeing on a crash report? Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, it definitely makes sense. I have not personally looked into that. If you leave me with your contact information, I am more than happy to connect with you and give you those exact numbers. In that data dashboard, that is one of the filters that we're exploring right now, is how you can vary at the zip code level rates of DUIs and crashes and injury-related crashes, and we have that all separated. So it is information that we have. I just don't know that we have looked exactly at that question. But it is a great one, and I agree with your point about the delayed time and what that complicates things. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for the last presenter. With the technologies that you discussed, you mentioned that there are sensors that detect movement. Say a child is left alone in the car. So has research or the manufacturers, have they put into consideration the occupancy factor? Because I understand movement alone is not enough, just in case a human is sitting still or a baby is sleeping. So has the factor of occupancy been put into consideration?
Yes. Yes. So we do have two different types of sensors in our technology. The first being an ultrasonic sensor, and so that one is a little less precise than the radar-based sensor that's offered in the other system. So with the ultrasonic sensor, it is going to detect movement, but like you said, the refinement on that level of movement is maybe not as good as with the or capable as with the radar-based sensor. So you are still going to detect movement, but you do have to be mindful of obstructions and the level of that movement. With the radar-based system, this is a new introduction. Up until recently, the in-vehicle radar was not allowed by the FCC, and so we had to go through and get waiver approval to have that system incorporated in the vehicle, and they've since done rulemaking to also permit that type of a sensor to be used inside the vehicle. So we did have some regulatory limitations to what type of technologies we could use to detect movement, and then that radar sensor is much more has a much more refined ability to detect movement. So it's actually capable of detecting breathing level movement, so the rise and fall of chest, and it can penetrate more surfaces. So say you had the car seat, or maybe you had a blanket over the baby, it would also be able to permeate through those and also detect the movement. So there are some technical and regulatory barriers sometimes to introducing new and different technologies that we have to consider as automakers.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe.
I had two questions. One for Ms. Sartin. Are you guys working with NHTSA to revise countermeasures?
We are not directly working with NHTSA. We are working with New Jersey stakeholders specifically, so New Jersey DOT, as well as a lot of the, as we've been saying, boots on the ground level people, so getting that information about where car seat checks should be to the people who are scheduling car seat checks in New Jersey and organizing those types of efforts. So I would say, yeah, New Jersey DOT and the Highway Traffic Safety Office there is our primary partnership.
Thank you. And then Ms. Beeman, for your Alaska, or I mean, I'm from Alaska. For our state law, do you talk about your state laws when you're for unattended children in vehicles? We don't necessarily have one that says it. We don't. I mean, you could leave your child in the vehicle, and you know, so you might get child endangerment, but we per se can't. You know, so do you talk to people about, like, what is your laws and what do you have?
Yeah, so I would say that definitely folds into the policy side of things and the advocacy that we can do to create a legal framework that helps enforce some of these best practices of, you know, not leaving unattended children in vehicles. So we don't necessarily engage with each individual state on their specific laws. It is more advocating for best practices that states and federal adoption can occur that way.
Thank you very much for attending today. We appreciate your attendance. And you can see on the Lifesavers app, there's an evaluation that you can do for our speakers and for this session, and also, thank you, that one. And if you have any questions further than that, you can get some information on all of our speakers on the app itself. So thank you very much.